The Vatican is facing a delicate situation, so much so that they have reserved a secure apartment on the 10th floor of the Gemelli Polyclinic. It's a story we already know. The same was said of John Paul II and repeated with Benedict XVI. But suddenly, the truth comes out. Now, it's Francis's turn. It is said that he is working, that he is reading documents, that everything is under control. But what if it wasn't? What if the Pope was really dying? If the See of Peter were vacant, the Church would be shaken by an internal war. The conclave would not just be an election, but a battle for the future of Catholicism. The world waits, but the real question is another. Are we prepared? Pope Francis's health raises questions and uncertainty among the faithful and the most attentive observers of the Church. The Vatican continues to communicate that the pontiff is stable, that the treatment is progressing as planned, and that he continues to work despite his condition. However, this official version reminds us of similar situations experienced with John Paul II, when the Holy See maintained equally ambiguous communication until the announcement of his death. It is not new that the Vatican handles information about the Pope's health with great reserve, but this attitude does not reassure, but rather fuels speculation and fears. The expression stable condition is a set phrase that might not mean improvement, but rather anticipate a gradual worsening. The problem is not only one of transparency, but also of spiritual responsibility. The Church asks the faithful to pray for the Pope, which is correct, but how to pray specifically without knowing the truth about his real condition. If Francis is near the end, it would be fair to communicate it clearly so that the Christian people can accompany him with prayer in his last earthly battle. A crucial aspect is also the political and ecclesial context in which this situation is framed. One cannot analyze the health of Pope Francis without taking into account the importance that his possible disappearance would have on the internal balances of the Church. We are talking about a pontificate that has deeply divided the Catholic world, with an increasingly evident fracture between those who support his reforms and the critics who see them as a dangerous departure from tradition. If he died, there would immediately be a struggle for his succession, a topic that in Rome they would prefer to postpone. It is not surprising that rumors have recently surfaced about the Pope's long-term plans, almost to give the impression that he is still fully operational, but it is a strategy already seen. John Paul II, too, in his last months, continued to sign documents and make decisions despite his advanced illness. Papal power can never appear vacant, even when the Pope is already exhausted. The strategy, in these cases, is always the same. Reassuring statements, ambiguous phrases, some sign of optimism to maintain control of the situation, until, suddenly, the announcement of death arrives. It is not a coincidence, but a precise decision to prevent the Church from falling into uncertainty and chaos. However, if John Paul II's crisis was managed in a still relatively stable context, today, the Vatican is experiencing unprecedented fragility. The death of Pope Francis would not only be the end of a pontificate, but the breaking point of a fracture that has divided the Church for years. But there is another possibility which few dare to speak about openly. What if Francis did not die, but decided to resign? What if his state of health was so serious as to force him to follow in the footsteps of Benedict XVI? The presence of a second Pope Emeritus would plunge the Church into even greater chaos. Two living popes, one resigned, the other newly elected. And at that point, the inevitable question would be who will come after him. Here, the control of information becomes essential. If the Pope's health were more compromised than is admitted, it would mean that the struggle for succession has already begun behind the scenes. Francis has been the Pope of reforms, of doctrinal openings, of declarations that have bewildered Catholics most attached to tradition. His disappearance would create a power vacuum that could trigger one of the most heated battles ever seen in a modern conclave. Even in an age when the Church has lost much of its influence, the Pope remains a figure of global reach. His death would provoke immediate reactions, not only among the faithful, but also among governments and institutions that have found in Francis an ally on issues such as climate change, immigration, and global governance. But the real problem would not be the official rhetoric of condolences, but what would happen behind the scenes? Who would take control of the narrative? What would be the first moves of the College of Cardinals? Within hours, the Vatican would activate a well-defined protocol. The Chamberlain, currently Cardinal Kevin Farrell, would have the task of officially certifying the Pope's death. During the days of the vacant see, which last between 15 and 20 days, the cardinals would meet daily to discuss current affairs and prepare for the conclave. But unlike the times of John Paul II or Benedict XVI, today the Vatican is a powder keg. What if Francis did not die, but decided to resign? In this scenario, the protocol would undergo a radical change. The Chamberlain would not be needed to certify the death, but the Pope would have to publicly and unambiguously declare his decision to leave the pontificate. From that moment, the apostolic see would be equally vacant, and the College of Cardinals would temporarily assume control of the Church. The transition period would be similar to that following the death of a pope, with the general congregations in which the cardinals would meet to discuss the future of the Church. But the presence of two popes emeritus would make the situation even more tense, with the risk that the election of the new pontiff would be strongly conditioned by the legacy of Francis and by the cardinals appointed by him. The majority of the Sacred College is already made up of prelates in line with his progressive vision, but this does not guarantee an easy election for his current. On the contrary, the fracture between the two souls of the Church could turn the conclave into an unprecedented battle. In recent decades, political maneuvers within the Church have become increasingly evident. If with John Paul II and Benedict XVI, the pontificate was guided by a clear doctrinal imprint, with Francis there has been a change of course, with a more political and less theological approach. Consequently, the next conclave will be a clash between two opposing visions of the Church. On the one hand, those who want to continue and intensify the path started by Francis. On the other, those who are pushing for a decisive return to tradition. But the challenge will not only be theological. There are also enormous geopolitical interests at stake. The future pope will have to guide a church that already has a different role in the delicate international balances. The increasingly secularized West, tensions with China over the appointment of bishops, the weight of the Holy See on issues such as immigration and climate change, all these elements will influence the decisions of the cardinals, who will not only have to choose a spiritual leader, but also a political and strategic reference point. At this point, the names that are most frequently mentioned for the succession begin to emerge. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State, is seen as the guarantor of continuity, the ideal candidate for those who want to avoid shocks. He has managed Vatican diplomacy with discretion, but he does not enthuse either progressives or traditionalists. On the opposite front, Cardinal Robert Sarah, a symbol of the conservative wing, would represent a clear change of direction with respect to Francis. His election would mark a return to traditional liturgy and a halt to the doctrinal openings of recent years. However, his ascent to the papal throne seems unlikely. With a majority of progressive cardinals, the modernist bloc would do everything possible to prevent it. Another name that is frequently mentioned is that of Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, president of the Italian Episcopal Conference and close to the community of Sant'Egidio. Considered a point of balance between the progressive front and the more moderate one, Zuppi could represent the ideal option to guarantee a smooth transition. His role in the diplomatic negotiations between Russia and Ukraine has given him an international profile, but for traditionalists, he would still be a legacy of Francis's pontificate. Among the possible outsiders, names such as Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, Filipino, and one of the closest to Bergoglio, and Cardinal Christophe Pierre, Apostolic Nuncio, to the United States, a key figure in relations between the Vatican and American institutions, emerge. However, their election would be anything but certain, since the next conclave will inevitably have to find a meeting point between the deep divisions that run through the Church. But beyond strategies and power balances, there is a spiritual aspect that cannot be overlooked. Regardless of what happens, the faithful must continue to pray. Pray for Francis, so that if his earthly path is about to end, he can face it in peace with God and with his own conscience. Pray for his healing, if his mission is not yet over. Pray for the Church, because every time the throne of Peter is empty, it is not just a leadership crisis, but a spiritual battle that goes beyond human logic. And finally, pray for the future, because the decisions made in the next conclave will mark the destiny of the Church in the coming decades. What do you think? If you liked the video, comment Amen. God bless you.